Join us for a journey as we go back to the great civilizations of the past. Who were the people? What were they like? How did they begin? And how did they end? Let's find out on episode 19, Greece in the early 9th century BC. Last time on the Fan of History, Ashurnasirpal II, chosen of Ashur, king of Assyria, marched victoriously to the Mediterranean from Assyria. But now it's time to talk about the Greeks, who will become very important to our story. Dan, what's going on over in Greece?
Well, we haven't talked about them much yet, but they will become very important. Let me ask you, Brennan.
Sure.
What do you think about when you think about ancient Greece?
Oh, Parthenon, civil discourse, basically the seat of civilization. Those are the images that are, embedded in my brain as far as Greece is concerned.
Any particular places?
Like Athens, and let me think of where else.
Maybe a city filled with crazy warriors?
Like Sparta.
Yeah.
Yes, there will always be Sparta because of 300.
Yes.
I will always think about that.
We'll make 3 episodes just about Sparta.
Nice.
Not too far from now. The picture we have of Greece is almost everything is from the 5th and the 4th century BC. We are in the early 9th century BC, and Greece is a very different place. Extremely different. Because when I started the Fan of History project, I considered everything just practicing on presenting ancient history because I wanted to talk, and I still haven't, about the Bronze Age collapse. That's what I really want to cover back in 1200 BC. And the Bronze Age collapse is pretty much the total end of civilization, especially for Greece. So the old Bronze Age civilization, the guys that fought the Trojans, Mycenae, it's all gone. There is today we consider history moving forward. Technology moves forward. Everything is always better in some sense.
Right.
The further you go into time, but that has not always been the case. And this is one spectacular example of how civilization ends.
Wow.
So we have to talk about that a bit here.
Okay, I was about to ask, what actually brought on the collapse? Because you would think at this point, once you've been able to smelt bronze and can actually, work with a, durable substance like that, you'd think that there wouldn't be such a terrible collapse.
Maybe I'll also make a case for the fact that this collapse actually made Greece into the cradle of Western civilization, because I don't think Mycenae could have been that cradle. But before we go any further, we should define what we mean by the Greeks, because that's not very clear at this time. The name Greeks come from the Romans, because the Romans encountered one tribe of Hellenes called the Greci, and they just thought, okay, everybody over here are like these guys, so they are the Greeks.
Just some broad generalization happening.
Soon the Greeks will refer to themselves as the Hellenes. But right now, in the 9th century BC, that sounded weird. In the 9th century BC and before, they referred to themselves as 2 peoples, the Dorians and the Chians. and maybe even the Ionians. And you will see when they appear in the Assyrian records, they are always the Ionians. But first, let's talk about the Bronze Age collapse then.
Okay.
We have Mycenae, this powerful civilization with city-states, some of whose names you will recognize, like Athens, back in the 13th century BC. There is the Trojan War. We know that a war happened and Troy was involved. We found Troy in the 19th century, AD. But this civilization was totally destroyed. And it happened for many reasons, but the main problem was a migration of a nomadic people called the Dorians, who came from the north. And we have like the last records of the Mycenae civilization is like, oh no, they are coming, we have to keep watch, oh, keep guard, oh, what the hell is going on? And then they are all gone, and all the cities are destroyed, all the cities are abandoned. And even though Athens actually exists in the 9th century BC, in the early 9th century BC, it's nothing like the big city that was in the 13th century BC, and it's nothing like the big city that will arise, nothing like classical Athens. So these were nomadic herdsmen, and the Greeks will later tell the story that they were the sons of Hercules coming back to reclaim his land. So they were like, they were actually Greeks, but they were far from it. They didn't have a written language, and the old written language, Linear B, is that now I'm out on thin ice here. But the written language of the Mycenaean civilization was lost and gone forever. People forgot how to read and write for 400 years.
Wow.
That was an ancient language that was very hard to learn, and you just didn't have time to teach anybody. The Dorians were warriors, and they were nomadic herdsmen, and you pretty much had to become a nomadic herdsman to escape the Dorians. You could then take your herds and hide in the mountains and survive. The only parts of the Greek, what we consider today Greece, that wasn't invaded was Attica, where Athens is. So a pocket of Achaeans survives in Attica, and Athens actually survives and is never taken in the Dorian invasion. And the structure of this invasion is very unclear, then it's only legendary. So there's a question if there was actually any method to it, if they just plundered and ran, and it was just chaos. This had actually happened to Greece before in 2000 BC, which was surprising to me when I read this. But staying in the cities was crazy, because then the Dorians would find you. They didn't get to the islands in the island of Euboea. This will be a pronunciation nightmare for many episodes to come. The island of Euboea is the second biggest island in Greece, second only to Crete. Mm-hmm. And it's located very close to the mainland, north of Attica, and that will be a very important place, but it was not invaded either. And the islands in the Ionian Sea also survives. But eventually the Dorians will island hop as well, but they will be a bit friendlier on the islands. But pretty much the total collapse of civilization, it only ends because the Dorians become civilized. And there is an influence on them, which is quite unclear, from like this ancient heroic heritage of the Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. The legends of the Trojan War, for example. And I'll make a case for that Homer was a real person, the guy who made the Iliad and the Odyssey,
Right.
and that he hasn't lived yet. But it's stories like his, the ancient legends of the heroes, the common language, they will be able to understand each other, the Dorians and the Chians, and the gods, because the religions will merge. That will forge a Greek identity, but it hasn't happened yet in the early 9th century BC. There is some outside influence on the area that will become Greece. It's mainly from the Phoenicians. Do you remember the Phoenicians?
Oh, yeah.
They are, of course, trading with everybody.
Right.
And they're trading here. They're trading with Euboea. They are trading with Athens. And they're probably trading with the Dorians as well, if they can. There is Attican goods from this age found in Cyprus and in Syria. And many Greeks flee the Bronze Age collapse to Cyprus. So Cyprus we'll probably make an episode about Cyprus as well, because Cyprus is sort of the place to flee to. And eventually it will be the Phoenicians who will teach the Greeks to read and write again. There are also the Phrygians.
Right.
Mostly famous for their Phrygian cap. Their silly little hat that the Smurfs have.
That's funny.
That cap will symbolize freedom during the French Revolution. They are actually in Macedonia and Thrace at this time. And they will migrate at some unclear time to Turkey. And they have a lot of influence, but it's quite unclear exactly what they contribute to the Greeks. The Dorians will become civilized. Eventually they settle down and form towns or villages. It's very hard to call them cities yet. Nothing can be called a city in Greece in the 9th century BC. And you usually call the time between 1200 BC and 800 BC the Dark Age.
Okay.
And then you get into the Archaic Age between 800 and 500 BC or 400 BC. And then you have Ancient Greece or Classical Greece starting in 500 or 400. But some spectacular city-states that will play a lot of importance later is Sparta, which is a very Dorian city, Corinth and Argos. There is an event in Sparta that we'll actually talk about in the main narrative called the Eunomia. And that is sort of the end of chaos, where the Spartans become the Spartan state by imposing order on themselves, pretty much. And that hasn't happened yet. So the Spartans are still a lot of crazy nomadic herdsmen warriors, but they will be proud of this heritage. So there will be a lot in the Spartan state that looks back to the Dorian heritage. And the Spartans and the people from Argos, they are probably the most Dorians of Dorians. So they will always be doing Dorian things, being proud of the Dorian heritage. Athens lives. Strangely enough, but it's Athens of the 9th century BC is a very, very different place from anything you think of Athens. They claim that they have like a line of kings, and then they become the archons instead.
Okay.
But it's a village of at most a couple of thousand people. And you can see in the archaeological record how the city is abandoned and how it just shrinks into this small village. But they can, in the 9th century BC in Athens, build ships, and they do trade, but they can't read and write.
How did they manage trade? Is there any record of how they even accomplished this? Or is it just all... I think of trade and I think of what I'm sure the Phoenicians thought too is you have to be able to keep a record of incoming and outgoing. And I can't imagine, trading long term without some sort of ability.
Strangely enough, trading is a lot older than record keeping. But trading is the reason that record keeping or writing appears in Mesopotamia then, long before this. But they could do trade. But one way they do their trade is by piracy. So Greek pirates will be a thing, and that's actually the first time they are mentioned in the Assyrian sources, is when they go on pirate raids. And they become a nuisance to the Assyrians because they are plundering stuff on the sea.
Wow.
And like attacking coastal towns and this island of Euboea that I mentioned, somebody correct me on the pronunciation. There are two cities on Euboea, or two important villages probably at this point, but they will become the most important cities in Greece, more important than Sparta or Athens at first. And it's Chalkis and Lefkandi. And they are perfectly located to take advantage of the Phoenician influence, more so than Athens actually. And they will also be the first big colonizers from Greece. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves.
All right.
So Greece is a very bleak place. The reason that some Achaeans survive is that Greece is a very mountainous place, very hilled. That's why there are so many city-states eventually, because you are like naturally separated. There are valleys and then there are very high mountains. And you sort of have a pass or two that you can leave your valley. So it's very easy to form a state in a valley and then not have too much contact with the next valley.
Well, that makes sense. One thing that kind of strikes me with just this overview of, the Dark Age in Greece is, I know we don't often pull in modern, talk about what's happening today compared to what's happening then. But if you look at recent events, this being the year 2015, for those tuning in from the future, welcome from the past. But Greece recently suffered a huge economic downturn. I mean, just catastrophic. Almost the entire country was bankrupt. It was, I don't know if it's that extreme, but it was really, really bad, and they were trying to get help being bailed out and whatnot. A consequence of that, as I was reading today, there is a huge exodus of tech workers from Greece because there's just not the kind of pay. They can't get their pay in Greece. So if you want to look at it in terms of history, Greece is heading towards almost like a IT dark age because they can't afford to keep the talent. So it's just up and leaving. So, and if you think about it long term, how does that affect the profitability of things in Greece? Everything's IT. Everything is internet related. Everything's networked. And if they're losing all of their skilled workers, what happens then?
That'll be a problem.
Big problem. It's like something can't get better.
Like I said, we really take technological advancement as a given. Mm-hmm. But civilization can end and has done so several times. The other spectacular example is Britain in the 5th century AD, when the Romans leave, and Britain really, really has a backward development. And 200 years later, people think that giants built the roads and aqueducts.
Wow.
But the Bronze Age collapse sticks out as the biggest example in world history, I think. It's pretty much the end of civilization everywhere. And there is a final everywhere around the Mediterranean in the sort of Western world.
Right.
And there's a final stand in Egypt when one pharaoh fights an epic battle against chaos, and it's fantastic. But we'll cover that later.
Okay.
So Egypt is the only nation state that really survives the Bronze Age collapse.
Wow, that's amazing.
The Greeks then will appear in our story. They will learn to read and write. They will be very different from everybody else in that they will they will start thinking for themselves in a way nobody ever has done before. Any questions on the Greeks?
No, I think that's it for me for now. I guess on the next episode, we're going to take a look at the army of the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
We will. And the Assyrians are many centuries ahead of the Greeks at this point. So it's really, in Assyria, things are moving ahead. But they are a very conservative people, and they don't think in terms of advancement in the way we think. They are very traditional.
Right. If it was
the Assyrians will invent a lot of stuff, and we'll talk about that as well. But they won't think as radically in new ways like the Greeks will.
I guess necessity does breed invention.
One more thing I should mention, the Greeks actually. There is, in the 8th century BC, there is, and it starts now, or at this point in our story in the 9th century BC, there is a very big, very favorable weather conditions. And you have this enormous growth of farming. And that's why the herding is not as important, because it suddenly becomes very profitable to farm, and you can feed a huge population. There's a population boom that is quite big.
Makes sense.
So from this abandoned country where population has dwindled because of Dorian invasion,
right,
population will suddenly explode pretty much, and that's the main reason for the colonization process that starts in the 8th century BC.
All right, that's very interesting. Well, folks, that brings us to the end. Please go to our YouTube, like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And share us out, tweet us out, like us on Facebook. Also, please give us a review on iTunes. We really appreciate that. Facebook/Fan of History. Same with Twitter /The Fan of History. Also, if you want to check out Dan's work on the web, it is thefanofhistory.wordpress.com. And for the Fan of History, I am Brennon.
And I'm Dan.
And we appreciate you tuning in. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon.com/fanofhistory. Just $1 an episode would help us out. Thanks, and see you next time.